such examples was the famine in Ukraine, where approximately 7 million people have lost their lives.
Yes, famine in Ukraine would be an example of how the Soviet Union dealt with the Ukrainian nationalists. The Ukrainian famine was actually a political strategy which aimed to destroy Ukrainian aspirations for independence by collecting the harvest from the Ukrainian people.
Well, there are speculations on whether the Ukrainian famine was actually planned by the USSR, but it is for sure known that millions have tragically lost their lives. Everyone who has ever heard of the Holodomor in Ukraine in the years of 1931 to 1933 knows that it was one of the most tragic events in the history of the Ukrainian people. Before we continue with our conversation, I would like to show you this footage which we made for today's show. Speaking of Holodomor, we have a person who survived during this time, and she would like to share her story with us.
I survived the Holodomor. Back then, I was 9 years old, but the horrific times I had experienced in my childhood still are with me today. I remember that before the Soviet regime established collectivization, our village had churches and schools. Shortly afterwards, everything changed. It seemed as though the collectivization was set up to destroy people's lives instead of making it easier. I remember one day when I went with my brothers to the forest to find some berries or food or mushroom seeds, yet no sign of remains were left. My family was starving, and we were desperate for food. I remember returning back from the forest one time, and on our way back home, we saw a man who lay down to die. The man was practically only bones, and he was dying. There was nothing we could do to help this man, for we knew it would soon happen to ourselves.
As you have seen, life under the USSR for the Ukrainians was extremely difficult. The Karl Marx theory of an equal and classless society wasn't realistic enough to happen in the USSR.
Yes, I agree, and I think that is actually one of the many reasons why the Soviet Union fell apart eventually.
Well, it is hard to prove so, but the Holodomor definitely left a dark trace in the Ukrainian history.
Yes, and currently there are many disputes between the Russian and Ukrainian governments on whether the Ukrainian famine was a planned genocide to eliminate the Ukrainian race. When we hear about such events of history, we're puzzled of why they happen within nations. Who can explain what caused so many deaths and suffering of innocent civilians?
For the Soviet government, the collectivization of agriculture was necessary for the industrialization of the country. Since the vast majority of the population was rural, there was very little manpower available for industry. Simultaneously, Russian agriculture was not enough for most activities that were already being merchandised in countries like the United States, Britain, and Germany, were still being accomplished through the manual labor in the Soviet Union. The Soviet leadership decided that Soviet agriculture had to be modernized rapidly, and if necessary, through force.
Modernization through force had its outcome. The Holodomor of 1931 to 1933 was the fault of collectivization, a policy pursued under Stalin between 1928 and 1940. The goal of this policy was to consolidate individual land and labor into collective farms.
The collectivization of agriculture in the Soviet Union also was to hand in hand with the collectivization of almost all other areas of economy, which put an end to the new economical policy period.
During the Soviet Union times, what do you think contributed to the abandonment of the economic system that existed in Russia from 1918 to 1921 called War Communism in favor of the new economic policy?
The 1921 Soviet Krasnodar rebellion, staged by sailors at the naval base, shook the confidence of the regime and contributed to the abandonment of war communism in favor of the new economic policy, argued for Lenin and approved by the 10th Party Congress in March 1921.
What did the new economic policy accomplish, and what was the opinion of communists about it?
The new economic policy relaxed government control over the economy, especially in agriculture, and allowed limited private enterprise in an attempt to facilitate economic recovery. The communists declared, however, that it is only a temporary retreat before resuming to march to socialism.
But wasn't war communism useful as a basis for this new economic policy?
Yes, it was. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin later revived many features of war communism in his industrialization drive of the 1930s and the Soviet economic new policy system that followed. However, this policy by any means cannot go along well with post-communist countries.
Can you clarify the concept of post-communist countries? And are they still clearly identified groups?
Post-communist countries are basically the new title for the communist economies and economic change. Despite the dramatic change experienced in the past decades, the post-communist economies still form a clearly identifiable group, distinguished by the impacts of the years of communist rule, and this looks set to remain true for many more years.
I'm sure there is a direct connection between present economic performance and social welfare. Correct me if I am wrong.
No, you are right. The Russian economy has grown impressively since 1999, and by some measures is one of the fastest growing economies in the world. The growth has brought an improvement in the standard of living in the average Russian citizens and has brought economic stability that Russia had not experienced in at least a decade.
How is success in favor for the former President Putin?
This success is a major factor in the popular support for the former president, now Prime Minister Putin, enjoys some 70 to 80% of the population view him favorably. The improvement in the Russian economy is also arguably a factor in the boldness in which the Putin leadership has reasserted Russia's status as a world power, challenging the United States, Europe, the former Soviet states, and economic and national security areas. Putin himself acknowledged the potency of Russia's unchanged economic power. Some experts assert that the Russian economy will continue to strengthen and categorize Russia with Brazil, India, and China as among the fastest growing economies. Others argue that Russia's economic prospects face risks.
Why do you think today lots of European countries and former Soviet states are so dependent on Russian natural gas?
Well, Russia has many of the world's largest reserves of oil, natural gas, and other raw materials, many of which are critical to industrial countries. That's why any European countries and former Soviet states are highly dependent on Russia's natural gas.
Who else can explain Russia's significance in the market? U.S. exports to Russia are still relatively small. For some producers, such as poultry, energy, equipment, and technology, Russia is an important market. Russia is also an important supplier of a number of raw materials that are critical to the U.S. manufacturers. The discussion we were intended to raise was about command economies and their inherent weaknesses. Please define for us what is a command economy.
A command or planned economy is an economy that is planned and ruled by the state government, in which resources are allocated to factories by the states throughout central planning. Command economy is more stable than others, guaranteeing constant exploitation of existing resources. It is least affected by financial downturns and inflation. In a carefully planned command economic system, both surplus production and unemployment rates remain at a reasonable level.
Planned economic system is also divided into two groups that are centralized and decentralized. The centralized or centrally planned economy, as prevalent in former Soviet Union, is more familiar concept between the two. The decentralized command economy, on the other hand, is more theoretical in nature with little or no application in the actual economic sphere. But who is the decisive leader in both types of economies?
It is significant that the government is the decisive authority that decides issues concerning everything about production, utilization of produced industrial products, and the division of income earned from their distribution. The government-certified planners divide all the hard work between the labor class, who go entirely through the labor process.
There is an unfair towards the labor class, but in the earliest centuries it might have been counted as a violation of the human rights.
I totally agree with you, Lena, and think that all people should be equal. Anya gives us some real-world examples of command and planned economy.
Well, if I have the opportunity to say, the best examples of command economies are China and the former USSR. Although today many countries are replacing planned economies by market economies in nations like Cuba and North Korea, planned economies still exist in real.
It is very interesting to see how the world is divided into different economies. This is our previous now and background.